May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Pat Johnson had it all. He had a beautiful wife, 2 beautiful children, lived in a beautiful home, and had many friends. He considered his life a fairy tale, and then it all fell apart. On Christmas night in 2012, the Johnson family attended a party at close family friend Logan Lee's house. The Johnsons had a great time and left the party at around 9:30 p.m. Tracy fell asleep at the car, so as soon as the family arrived home, Pat carried her up to her room and put her to bed. Pat and Jules then went to bed shortly after. They were tired after a long day of celebrating. Pat did not set the alarm that night, a decision that he thinks about every day and will always regret. And then later that night, while Pat was sound asleep in his bed, someone came into the house and raped and murdered his daughter. During the attack, Tracy cried out for help, "Daddy." If only Pat had heard her. On the morning of December 26, 2012, Pat awoke to the sound of his wife Jules screaming hysterically. She had gone downstairs to read the newspaper and to make coffee, but instead was greeted by a ransom note claiming that Tracy had been kidnapped by a small foreign faction. Pat and Jules ran up the stairs and ran into Tracy's room only to find that Tracy's bed was empty. Their daughter was missing. Panicked, they called the police. Even though the ransom note had told them not to, they just didn't know what else to do. Pat somehow managed to keep his composure as he spoke on the phone with the dispatcher. He put on a cool, collected front to try to help his family. He had always been the strong one in his family. On the inside, though, he was crumbling. Unfortunately, Pat's call to the police was routed to an exhausted officer, Colby Swiss, who was at the end of his 16-hour shift. Swiss went to the Johnsons' house, did a cursory search, and looked at the ransom note. He then called the FBI for backup, since it is customary for the FBI to assist with the kidnappings. At 1:30 p.m., Swiss had no leads, and Pat and his friend Logan decided together to do a thorough search of the house. They started in a logical place, an out-of-the-way room in the basement that would be a natural hiding spot. And to Pat's horror, what he found hidden there was his daughter's mangled, lifeless corpse. He dropped to the ground, sobbing next to his daughter. Logan turned and ran upstairs. It was then that Officer Swiss began a chain of events that ended in this trial of this poor, innocent man. Swiss told the FBI that since this was a murder, not a kidnapping, he did not need their assistance. The FBI offered to help anyway, but Swiss, out of pride, foolishness, or simply exhaustion, declined the offer. Perhaps he had already made up his mind. He had determined without any evidence that Pat was the killer. He had concluded his investigation before it ever really began. Now let's imagine if the FBI had gotten involved, or if the Lawton Police Department hadn't been undermanned and overwhelmed. Let's imagine what a proper investigation would have looked like. Officers could have questioned all of the people who had keys to the Johnsons' household, including their housekeeper and several friends. Officers could have cordoned off the crime scene and searched for physical evidence before it was destroyed. Officers could have investigated the 8 known sex offenders living within 2 miles of the Johnsons' home. And most importantly, officers could have investigated 2 extremely plausible suspects, Mr. Kinder and Mr. Lee. Let's start with Mr. Kinder. As you heard, private investigator Morgan Query testified, Mr. Kinder not only confessed to the murder of Tracy Johnson, but also knew the key detail, never disclosed publicly, that the ransom note had been restarted twice. Officer Swiss refused to consider Mr. Kinder as a suspect for 2 reasons that made no sense. First, Swiss said that there were no signs that the Johnson house had been broken into. Of course, the basement window had been broken several months earlier and hadn't been fixed, and Mr. Kinder could have easily climbed into that window. Swiss said that it didn't look like there were any footprints in the dusty snow around the premises, but maybe if he hadn't been so exhausted, he would have realized that the snow could have blown around in the several hours between when Mr. Kinder climbed into the window and when Swiss arrived at the scene. Second, Swiss said that Mr. Kinder had been in Alabama on the 24th, hadn't booked a plane ticket, and hadn't been spotted in Lawton. Again, if Swiss hadn't been so overwhelmed, perhaps he would have been able to do some simple arithmetic and realize that Mr. Kinder could have easily left Alabama on the morning of the 25th, driven the 1,000 miles to Lawton in 14 hours, arrived in Lawton late at night on Christmas, climbed into the Johnsons' broken window, and then done the horrible deeds that he confessed to. And then, of course, he would have left town in the middle of the night before anyone could spot him. But Swiss didn't want to let facts interfere with his already made-up mind. And then there's Mr. Lee. a man with the key to the Johnson's house, a man who knew the layout of the house well, a man who helped Mr. Johnson build the wine cellar, which was right next to the room that Tracy was found in, a man who made Tracy Johnson feel, quote, creepy, a man who was jealous of Pat's wealth, angry at him, and knew the exact amount of Pat's last bonus, the same amount written on the ransom note, and a man who, upon seeing Tracy's corpse, immediately turned and sprinted away, even though he had years of police training and could have taken steps to preserve the crime scene. Maybe he didn't want it preserved, but Swiss never even investigated him. Maybe there's some sort of police code. Maybe Swiss just didn't have the manpower. Maybe he had already made up his mind. If a real investigation had been conducted, Mr. Lee would have been questioned and his DNA samples would have been collected. But no real investigation was done. Instead, Swiss just assumed, on the basis of no actual evidence, that Pat murdered the light of his life. Swiss thought that Pat seemed too calm, ignoring the fact that Pat was trying to protect his family and doing everything he could to stay as stoic as his worst nightmares unfolded around him. And Swiss thought that Sarah Lute's statement was incriminating, ignoring the possibility that Tracy's dying scream of "Daddy" was a cry for help from the man who had always protected her. Pat Johnson has already lost enough. We should not take away his freedom. In this case, there is far more than reasonable doubt that there are at least two men who are much more plausible suspects than Pat Johnson ever was. It is not his fault that an exhausted, overwhelmed police officer failed to investigate them. Your Honor, Counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has not brought forth enough evidence to convict my client, Tracy's loving father, Pat Johnson. After reviewing all of the evidence, the defense asks that you find Pat Johnson not guilty of the felony of rape and murder in the first degree. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.